Well, welcome everyone. This is our Managing and Financing Silent Cyber Risks webinar. It's part of our Building Business Resilience series that we're running at the moment. It's great to have you here, and I hope you enjoy our presentation today. So what we're covering today is, well, firstly, I might introduce our team. So firstly, Faisal Janif is our Head of Cyber Risk Consulting. He's on co-presenting today with Kelly and Ben. He leads our cyber practice for the Pacific. He's really been instrumental in a number of cybersecurity engagements that we've been doing with major clients. He's has a pretty good distinguished background working for multinational organizations as a Chief Information Security Officer. With Faisal's Kelly, she's our head of the cyber practice in the Pacific, oversees a lot of that cyber insurance placement work, and as a senior advisor on many of our largest clients here in the Pacific. And also Ben Crowther, who's our head of strategic risk, looks after bringing all this sort of together in an enterprise risk management and resilience framework, 20 plus years experience in strategy and research and risk. And so hoping, between these three, we've got a lot of great expertise, and from a cyber perspective, but also from a risk perspective, that hopefully we can together add some value to this challenging subject of cyber risk, particularly silent cyber risk. So today, this is how we're going to approach it. We're going to talk about silent cyber and how insurers are responding across multiple insurance classes, what that means. We're going to talk about how cyber risk can move from the online world into the physical world, and share some examples of that, how operational technology can enable that to happen. We're going to be talking about how you can identify and quantify your risk. And we're going to be looking through the lens of silent cyber in terms of material damage and business interruption. And Kelly's going to take us through the standalone insurance solutions that are available for you if from a material damage business interruption side. And then finally, how you can better manage this risk. And we know there's the best approach is making sure that the likelihood of this event happening severely reduced, and reducing the severity so that if it does happen, that you don't have as much loss at risk. And Faisal will be talking through that. And finally, we'll have a Q&A at the end. So please put your questions through. We'll have some time at the end to go through your questions. There'll also be a poll at the end. I'll remind you at the end, but there will be a poll where you can go in and put some comments or additional areas of interest that we can follow up with you and share some further comments and materials on as well. So that's our agenda for today. We look forward to hearing your questions, and we will share this presentation and a link to it for everyone who attends. And I'll hand the time over to Kelly. Thanks, Kelly.
Thanks, Zane. We thought it was best to set the scene of what silent cyber is. I know this word gets thrown around quite a bit, but it's also important to understand why this is an issue now faced by the market. So technology continues to reshape the business landscape and intensify cyber risk for companies in every industry, size, segment. Almost every asset is remotely connected, controlled, managed, and therefore potentially vulnerable. Connectivity of technology and data of physical assets increases insurers' exposure to potential vulnerabilities, and thus the consequence of a cyber event. Cyber attacks have moved beyond data breach. We all know that to some very sophisticated schemes designed to disrupt businesses and supply chains. Affirmative cyber, either via a cyber policy or affirmative grant in other lines like property, kidnap and ransom, or crime, covers an insured for loss of liability arising from harm. And the real key word here is intangible assets, and we'll touch on that a little bit more. Although cyber insurance uptake has risen rapidly and steadily each year, only about half of the buyers have purchased a cyber policy, and limits and limits purchase are not really, there hasn't been a lot of science as to why a client has taken a particular limit, causing them to turn to other lines of insurance if there is a cyber event as well. And we saw that a lot really around the NotPetya and WannaCry times a couple of years ago. Traditional insurers contend that they've seen claims stemming from cyber events that they had neither underwritten nor charged for, thus creating unmeasured exposures within cyber insurance portfolios. This has led the insurer concern around solvency going forward, and they are now really trying to clarify cyber insurance and where and if it should be covered under cyber insurance policies. So we'll touch on what that means between all of those. So really the silent cyber arises in instances when there is a cyber policy, an insurance policy where cyber events has triggered for a loss are not explicitly included or excluded. Cyber exclusionary language within the policy is ambiguous, pardon me. Express cyber coverage grants were ambiguous or conflict within other policies and wordings. So really, what we really need to define what cyber risk is. And again, cyber is a big word that we use a lot. Lately, there has been a lot of focus on trying to define cyber as a peril, not because but because cyber is not a physical thing. This is proven to be really difficult for clients. We feel it is more relevant, particularly in the context of insurance, to understand what cyber risk is. So cyber risk is the possibility of loss or injury of, relating to, or involving data or technology. And that's why we've pulled this slide together to make it easier for you. Data used to be stored mostly in paper form, personal records, ledgers, business plans, and records. It was only when that information began to be gathered and stored electronically that we began to equate data with cyber. Today, when we think of technology, we are really thinking about the physical devices that allow us to capture, to store, to share, and transmit data. But throughout time, technology has been understood to be the physical tools and devices that humans have created. As companies have become more dependent on electronic data for day-to-day business operations, the technology devices have become increasingly connected. So if we go to the next slide, thanks, Zane. So really, what are the consequences of a cyber event? And I think this slide really captures it well. Cyber risks exist whether from an attack or accidental, and that's really important to understand, that it's not, a lot of people perceive that this is, it has to be the hacker and with malicious intent to come in to cause chaos or destruction. It doesn't have to be. A lot of the incidents that we see from a client perspective come back to accidental, human error, whether they meant to click on a link or a disgruntled employee coming in, but we're seeing a lot more accidental issues that are resulting in cyber incidents. The direct impact of a cyber event is non-physical in nature, and these are the impacts that cyber policies are designed to address. But then we have the physical cyber impact, and this is secondary impact that occurs after something has happened to data, which leads to a physical change in the technology device or information relay, which leads to the physical peril, be it a fire, a collision, which results in property damage or bodily injury. A cyber event is not a direct cause of physical damage loss, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. The consequences of these physical and non-physical impacts are claims for which a variety of insurance policies may respond. Thanks, Zane. So really, how are insurance responding? And I know a lot of people on this call have been through renewals and they're seeing exclusions being put onto their policies. So really, insurers are trying to look at where there is any non-affirmative wording in policies, because they want to, this can result in inadvertent coverage of cyber exposure and thus measured and unexpected risk in insurers' portfolios. So what can this lead to? It can lead to coverage disputes, claims stemming from cyber events under non-cyber policies that didn't expressively cover for cyber exposures. Pricing. Underwriters may not have adequately considered cyber risk for insureds. You know, we've had policies, particularly on the traditional lines, your property, your liability, your financial lines policies were written many years ago before technology risk was an actual issue within clients' exposures. So they really haven't kept up to date with that. Risk exposures of insureds not adequately measured. Pricing doesn't reflect the cyber risk that now may be one of the client's main exposures. Accumulation. This is another big issue for clients. Silence risk, accumulation and aggregation is not identified and measured. And this really has come to the forefront when we look at some of the systemic risk exposure that we've seen. A really good example of that recently has been Microsoft Exchange, Cillian, SolarWinds, and more recently the pipeline and the flow-on supply chain risk that we've seen, the Colonial Pipeline over in the US. Again, we'll touch on that a little bit more. It was really interesting when silent cyber started to pop up in the industry. One of the big things ourselves as brokers were thinking about, as well as clients, is, isn't cyber a good thing for policyholders? Not necessarily. What that means is there's a lack of clarity may create mistaken belief that there is cover there, where it does not. You need to prove that the cover was there. It was the intention of the policy to respond that way. And we did see that again, going back to the NotPetya or the WannaCry incidents that we saw, where people didn't have a standalone cyber policy and relied on their property or their liability policies, and actually went to court to test that when insurers did look to decline claims, and unfortunately none were successful. Different interpretations by insurers of non-affirmative language can lead to claims dispute and legal actions, as I just mentioned. So insurers are starting to comply with silent cyber mandates, which have been set by cyber regulators and industry bodies such as Lloyd's of London. So they're doing this in four ways, but it won't surprise too many people on the call that number four seems to be one of the bigger, number three, I should say, seems to be where insurers are going, which is excluding cyber exposures. So really what we're asking insurers to look at, and the mandate was to either affirm or non-affirm coverage. It wasn't to just clearly exclude this coverage going forward. So we are seeing a few different tactics: affirming all cyber exposures within policies, regardless of technology involvement. So the advantage is obviously no cover reductions in current policies that you have, no disputes of the definition of cyber. But we found that a lot of this is being sublimited, doesn't cover the full gamut of cyber. So a cyber policy obviously provides the incident response and the non-tangible side of things. And then we see number two, which is affirming all cyber exposures, but sublimiting, again, reduction of cover, not necessarily covering all of the exposure. And number three, as I mentioned, one that we've seen more readily being applied by insurers, particularly company markets and Lloyd's of London, is really looking to exclude all cyber coverages going forward. And this is really a disappointing way the market is dealing with this at the moment, and it's something we're working on. And again, I'll touch on that a little bit later in this presentation. So really, from their point of view, this is clarifying coverage, but in our mind, it's kind of just pushing it to the middle and creating gaps that are just not acceptable for our clients. So the disadvantages is obviously that they'll look to put these exclusions on the policy, but that doesn't necessarily correlate with a reduction in the premium that you're currently paying. Physical losses cover may not be replicable under another policy, and we'll talk about the solutions as well. And then we're looking at excluding all cyber exposure by inserting write-backs for certain perils and losses. So better than an absolute exclusion, of course, but again, it's not comprehensive and doesn't really provide the solution that we're after. If we go to the next slide, thanks, Zane. Cyber risk in cyber, we just really wanted to give you a bit of a flavour of how a cyber claim could fall within two policies. So we've put a couple of examples on here. I appreciate that we haven't put a professional indemnity policy example on here, but that is something we're going to address separately in its own seminar, because that is quite a big topic, and it is a really new topic that we're experiencing in the market. So really, property was where it started. And if we look at a claim of a cyber event, malware attacks, encrypts the data on an automated machine line, shutting down the production. So we've seen this quite a few times from a manufacturing. I think every day you open the paper, there may be a new incident that you see. So what would be covered under a cyber policy? It'd be cyber IT forensics, business interruption, data restoration, and extra expensive. But what's that secondary impact? If the corrupted data causes the machinery to overheat and then catch fire, the fire causes damages to covered tangible property and business interruption expenses. Is this covered or excluded? With the exclusions coming onto policies, this is actually now looking like it will be excluded going forward. Marine liability is a very similar type of example that I won't run through. Liability, we're looking at a high-rise office building. It sustains a cyber attack that causes the elevator to go offline, and the building then needs to be shut down temporarily. So again, the cyber policy will cover what needs to be done immediately, the triage, the forensic, the business interruption, the data restoration if required, any additional expenses and business interruption. But what if if there's a visitor stuck in the building and they have a heart attack and no one can get to them and they unfortunately pass away in a trapped elevator? It seems like a really large, large scale example, but this could happen. So would that be covered under your general liability? At the moment, yes, but they are also looking to put exclusions within these policies for malicious incidents that results from a cyber incident. Directors and officers, another really good example. A publicly listed traded company experiences a data breach, cover provided as per the above, but then the company's stock drops, and there can be a security class action as a result of that. And this is happening. This is real. This has happened in the US, and more recently we have seen that there's been talk around that for a very large government organisation. So what is the mandate and what are the time frames from insurers in this regard? So I've put together the Lloyd's timetable because it seems that whilst this is relevant to Lloyd's and the Lloyd's syndicate markets, what we're finding is that company markets are following this very closely, as are reinsurers. So the reason property is such a prevalent topic, we have experienced this from the start of last year. That was one of the first you'll see in phase 1. We're now up to phase 3, and this is where we're seeing it really starting to impact the financial line sector. So your directors and officers, your crime, your financial institutions, and more recently, as I mentioned, the general liability side, where the exclusions previously related to data and mental anguish as a result of a data breach. This is now going as far as malicious events caused by a cyber incident. And then there is phase 4, which is pretty much covered everything, where we're looking at some of the treaty, casualty, marine war, and some marine XL as well. So I might hand back to Zane now to introduce our next topic of how does this lead to physical world losses.
Thanks, Kelly. And yeah, really great introduction to the topic. And so what we're going to go through now is just talk about how this, particularly from a physical world material damage point of view, leading into business interruption, how might that happen? How can that cyber breach, either malicious or accidental, result in real physical damage in the world? And so Faisal's going to lead this discussion. And so thanks, Faisal.
Thanks, Zane. So as you all can see, historically, there was quite a bit of delineation between the information and communication technology environments and the operational technology environments. They were run quite separately. Operational technology had a lot of hardware that wasn't that advanced in terms of how the other half operated in the information communication technology side. Now what we're seeing is there is a significant shift into digital transition and transformation, and there are a lot of interlinkages. And some of the major interlinkages that we're seeing at the moment is through your Active Directory systems, which hold critical information about your users, the devices they're using, and who's allowed to pretty much do what in your environment. Also, you have your identity and access management. What this does is it gives appropriate people appropriate access to different technologies and resources. A lot of these are now sitting in the IT environment and communicates two-way in and out of the operational technology environment. So therefore, if there is a breach in the IT environment, the hackers are able to then slide sideways, lateral movement into the operational technology environment. And once they're in there, the world is their oyster. They have access to SCADA systems. They have access to your programmable logic controllers, etc. The other significant change that we're starting to see now is the large adoption of IoT devices, which is the Internet of Things, and the IIoT, which is the Industrial Internet of Things. These devices are scattered all around your network, and they provide quite critical data back to your key primary sources. And these data relate from everything from if a door on a train is closing properly, to the temperature in water tanks, to how well a robot is moving around in a automated environment, to, if you look at mining, what the trucks are doing, the level of weight they're carrying, etc. And these are what we call the path of least resistance. These are easily hackable devices, which a lot of companies are running unsecured. And a lot of companies really do not understand how to secure these devices. Let me go to the next one, please. As you can see here, there's a couple of examples of some cyber breaches that have happened through a Stuxnet malware. Now, this was a game changer. This malware was a real game changer. We call it a multi-tenanted worm, purely because it's able to live either on a USB stick or on your device. If it's on your USB stick, as soon as you plug it into any hardware, it'll automatically move across into the environment. And where this really changed the game was it's able to give different data to the different parts of the operational technology, hardware and software. So it could potentially change the water pH level. It could adjust the heat, right, in different machines, right? So it can do a whole lot of malicious activity. However, what it also did was the feedback that came back to the main control board or the main controller, right, that didn't show any changes. So if you had people monitoring these controllers, they were unaware of anything malicious going on in that environment. All the temperature gauges, pressure gauges, everything was normal, reading normal. Whereas in the back end, there was slow change in pressure. So the pressures would build up, water temperatures could change, the different types of oxidations can change. So there was a whole lot of malicious activities going in the back end. However, in the front end of it, you really didn't see much because it actually controlled what you saw and kept everything level. And based on that, the data shows from McAfee that 80% of power companies in Mexico fell victim. We had 60% of companies in India, and these were some of the largest companies. We also understand that 1 in 4 power companies globally have been a victim of some form of extortion due to Stuxnet. Thanks, Sam. So moving on to what we're seeing now, how is it affected now? So if we have a look at the power industry, right, there's a number of different ways that the power industry can be disrupted. There's a number of different causes. There's a number of different outcomes. If you just simply take the transformation that the power industries are going on now in terms of moving towards renewable energy. So you have wind farms, you have these large fans out in the farms, right? That as they spin, they create the energy, and that energy is stored. Now, if a hacker was able to gain control of these and speed up the speed of the turbines in these wind farms, that could create a lot of significant damage. And that's just one possibility. You know, you're also looking at smart meter readers. You're also looking at different renewables. You're looking at battery operated systems, etc., where houses will try to be more self-sufficient in terms of adopting the solar power, charging it and keeping it, right? Now, these are all run via the providers, and if hackers are able to get into it, they could actually blow up some of these batteries. If we have a look at our healthcare, the healthcare has gone moving towards robotics. The Royal North Adelaide Hospital, what they do is they run robots that move around and pick up the food trolleys and deliver it to different wards. Now, if a hacker was able to get a hold of these robots, there could potentially be fatalities, there'll be significant casualties, there'll be significant legal ramifications. If we start to have a look at what's happening in our manufacturing side, you know, they use a lot of IoT devices and IIoT devices, so the Internet of Things and the Industrial Internet of Things, to actually monitor the maintenance of machinery, of trains, of trucks. This data can be manipulated, and if the data is manipulated, that means you have a whole lot of heavy machinery, right, that are going past their maintenance state, which could potentially lead to significant failures, and these significant failures could, you know, cause you know, factories to blow up, trucks to crash, trains to derail, etc. So what we're looking at, modification of information, there's a lot of stuff around sabotage, and we're also looking at, you know, the path of least resistance.
Thanks, Faisal. And now I think really the question that's on a lot of our minds then is knowing the problems in the insurance market, that these risks are often underinsured or in cases uninsured, and that these losses are now happening more frequently, is how can you identify what your cyber risks are, particularly the silent cyber side. And so Ben Crowther is going to take us through from a bit of a risk first perspective of how can you identify then quantify the risks in your particular organisation. Thanks, Ben.
Thank you, Zane. Thank you, everyone. I guess the important thing is that what we're understanding here today is that there are these risks, and it's important for risk managers and organisations to have an all of enterprise view of these. I guess from a risk management point of view, what we're trying to do is to help organisations with a framework to go through and explain cyber risk to a universal audience. And by saying that, I mean that it's not necessarily just a matter now of IT and cybersecurity people having a handle on and communicating these risks. We're finding more and more, for example, that the IT departments and the cybersecurity departments of organisations don't necessarily have a lot of control and oversight over the OT environment. And the business owners very much don't necessarily know the interaction and the role that IT plays. And certainly from boards and from a governance point of view too, there is more and more need for organisations to be able to communicate these risks and actually be able to tell the story of these risks. And as Kelly had alluded to earlier too, there are risks around the ultimate transfer of some of these types of risks. And what that might mean for organisations in the future is that many of them might actually have to essentially self-insure some of these exposures. So in order to do that, it is important that organisations go through a process to identify these risks using relatively well-established processes. So what are the things that we want to do? Yes, ultimately we want to understand within organisations what are the key operational technologies that the organisation has. But importantly, it's about breaking down those organisational components into their to various other categories to actually understand what those components are. What are those operational technology elements? For example, within a building management system, for example, you know, what are the power panels, the closed circuit TV, automatic devices, power generation, the power supply. All of these components roll up into what would be one building management system. And at any one point in time, as Faisal suggested, these are now being connected through the internet, has an ability to be impacted upon through your IT. So organisations have an ability now to really get some understanding about that. Our process too is to go through and identify what physical assets can be controlled by that, therefore. And importantly, what we want to try and do is to use a risk assessment process to understand, well, what are the most important ones? Where do we need to focus our attention? Thanks, Zane. So we do provide a bit of a framework here for you, and I guess it is important, as I mentioned earlier, that we want to go through a process to identify the risks, and to truly understand a risk. We want to go through and understand the causes, the control environments, and ultimately the impacts and some of those mitigation strategies. What's important, however, too, for when we're looking at silent cyber, is that we are ultimately wanting to look at the impact on assets too. And when we do have a look at impact on assets, that's sometimes an area where the organisations don't necessarily investigate. They might be looking at impacts on, say, brand and reputation. They might be looking at impacts on true financial or revenue impact, or even share price. But quite often what we don't necessarily see is that lens where we're examining the impact on specific assets. So just to go through a bit of a process in terms of how we can start to craft that story and craft that risk for people. The first two things start with, well, what are the vectors? What are those things that are actually going to cause these cyber attacks? And we have talked about, you know, they can be both malicious and accidental. Now, from a malicious point of view, this can come from anywhere. This can be, yes, malware or ransomware, but it can be through other attempts such as brute force, someone literally just trying, you know, trying until they get into your system. But there's other types of impacts. There's electromagnetic types of impacts, phishing, and then potentially even the risk that there could be some physical theft of an artifact, and that would allow someone to get access to your system. Again, we've mentioned also that accidental events can happen. So you can have all the most robust IT security systems in the world, but due to lack of training or due to a segregation of responsibilities, for example, there is a risk that you could be compromised. Ultimately, what are we looking at here? So we're looking at impacts to an IT system, but as Faisal has suggested, more and more what we're seeing is the ability for worms and for hackers to jump across from IT systems into your OT and to infect your data. This can be your building management systems, your SCADA systems, your servers, or anything else that's controlling things. The other thing that's very important for everyone to understand too, it doesn't necessarily need to be your assets. What happens if a third party or other assets are infected, or contractors or those sorts of things as well? So you might think that you've got your house in order, but to what extent does your supply chain have those things managed as well? We then move forward and then we start to think, okay, well, what can be some of the impacts? And I guess when we look at the impacts on IT or OT, broadly, we look at three broad things. Firstly, the confidentiality of data could be released. So that's where we're looking at, you might have private data or information that you're relying on that is leaked. The integrity of information and the systems that you're relying on. So someone could make modifications to a system. Faisal provided that example earlier where there could be changes made to your system without you even knowing. And obviously the availability of systems. And we see that happen as a result of a ransomware attack, of course, when you're actually not able to use a system or get access to a system. So we go through that process, and I guess it's important then to understand what then is going to be, are there going to be those asset impacts? So firstly, as we've discussed, there might be a risk that there is actual physical damage to an asset. And if it is an IT/OT asset, it's important to understand it might not necessarily be the asset as a whole. It could be the component parts or a part of an operational, or let's just say, for example, a building management system where it could be the air conditioner, or it could be the the elevator, for example, that is compromised. Importantly for that too, there are implications in terms of the repair. So what sort of repair processes are there involved? Does it need to be replaced? So all those cost concerns and the timing in terms of having some of those elements repaired and replaced. For example, does it require a piece of machinery to be put on a ship from Germany, for example? So there needs to be considerations for not only the replacement of some of these items if they were fully compromised, but the time it will take to actually replace them. Obviously, with any asset damage, there is likely to be impacts on revenue. And when we're looking at revenue impacts, we want to look at ultimately the impact on any direct revenue. And then the second cause and the second item that really needs to be addressed for organisations are additional costs. And there are a whole number of additional costs that organisations could be up for as a result of a cyber attack. And these are costs over and above what you would usually have, and costs that you would never usually be up for. Importantly too, we would see your business continuity plans having to be triggered in these respects. And a question for you out there too would be, to what extent do your business continuity plans actively go into specific assets and specific elements of your operational technology to address what you would do if there was an interruption, what sort of runarounds there would be. If we then look at the physical costs and these costs here, I guess the challenge that we face when we suffer cyber breaches is that there's no real definitive number. You won't be able to use a single loss estimate to try and arrive at a loss. It's not a loss as if you were to suffer a natural attack like your building burning down, or a cyber attack is you could have multiple cyber attacks. You could have all different types of severity. So from a quantification point of view, the approach that we take with our clients is to be far more probability-based with our modelling. And what that's saying is that we're trying to look at best case scenarios, worst case scenarios, and to work with you to actually look at the different range and probabilities and the types of outcomes. And that's going to be some important work that you'll need to do, particularly if some of these expenses are going to be self-insured. It's going to be the sort of information that you'll need to be communicating to your boards. So yeah, thank you very much, Zane.
Okay. Alrighty. Okay. So now, I'm going to hand the time over to Kelly. She's going to be talking us through, well, what is the insurance options available for these type of risks.
Thanks, Zane. And as Ben said, we're being asked more and more to help clients really understand what the exposure is first, and any gaps that may be being created in relation to some of these exclusions coming onto policies. But the most important question we're being asked at the moment is around that quantification piece. Whether there is a solution or not, and I'll talk to that right now, it's still very important for the board and for yourselves to be able to articulate that internally, so that you can make provisions from a balance sheet perspective if required. So once we do that, and look, we're working with the market at the moment. We know having any ambiguity within coverage is no longer an option. It's not good for anyone. We know that insurers have now been asked to mandate either whether they affirmatively cover cyber or affirmatively don't. Unfortunately, we now know that most insurers are going down the don't route and putting exclusions on these policies. From a Marsh perspective, we have global working groups of this at the very senior level, all the way up to our CEO, having discussions with all of the company markets, with Lloyd's, to try and create solutions. It is in our opinion that cyber risk, regardless of, so we know what cyber risk is, regardless of where it sits. We believe that if it results in a physical damage, that it should still sit within a property policy. We think that's what a property policy is designed to do. We're encouraging markets to consider it either as another peril, but actually underwrite for it, and we can help clients with their submissions to ensure to give insurers comfort around that. Unfortunately, from a solution point of view, in the current landscape, it's not great. where resultant physical loss is excluded from traditional policies, it will not typically be found under a standalone cyber policy. I probably get asked that every day. Why, if it's being pushed out of here, why isn't the cyber policy picking that up? And really, simply, the answer is that the cyber policies have never been designed for that. They have been designed around the non-physical world and the resultant damage as a result of that. If it's a really new market, it's only been around for 20 years, they do not have the premium pool that a property or liability policy portfolio has. If it was to include the physical damage, you could see that being wiped out very easily. So we are pushing back on the property insurance market to really step up here. Capacity, unfortunately, at the moment for physical cyber is limited and insufficient. It doesn't replicate capacity lost out of the property and casualty markets. Notionally, we're saying capacity is around 500 million. I have tested this. We actually think that this really tops out at about 300. And I appreciate the frustration from a lot of clients that will be on this call that doesn't even go close to, replicating what you currently have from a property program perspective. However, the solution is there. RAP and GAP products created so far are generally industry specific. So we really saw a demand from energy, manufacturing and marine. They were the first to experience the exclusions. So some GAP solutions have been created. They do offer restricted cover. So you need to be you need to work with a really good broker that understands what that means and ensures that the cover is clearly articulated. And they are low limits, as I said, and really primarily they're designed to address gaps in property policies. So at the moment, really don't go as far as the liability or financial lines, which we'll cover in another session. So really this can leave gaps. And as I said at the top, it's really important to know what those caps are so you can clearly articulate that to your boards. And the ultimate goal is obviously for us in addressing cyber risk is to have some clarity and for it to be consistent. That's one thing that we are not finding within the market, which is really disappointing. What is meant by cyber risk? We need to be really clear what that is. It's a big word. As I said, it has many different meanings, depending on who you speak to. We need to avoid categorization into good operating error and bad, the malicious intent cyber. Ensure any exclusions applied are not triggered simply because clients use technology to operate their business. This is again a really big topic that I'm working with many of our large and middle market clients. We need your insurers to understand what your technology risks are and take them along the journey as you continue to use it more widely. Aim to cover events, including cyber events leading to physical damage and a physical damage property policy. Talked about that. So there is unity of coverage and sufficient capacity. And you've really got to be mindful of coverage overlaps. I work really closely with the team on this call to make sure that we do, thorough gap analysis, because that you do want to avoid any overlapping and having insurers argue at the time of claim of where this should sit as well. Thanks, Zane.
Okay, thanks so much, Kelly. And look, we're going to hand the time over to Faisal now because we know the issues they're faced even with that standalone insurance solution. So how can you better manage the risk, particularly not just cyber risk generally, because we know organisations have been grappling with that for quite a few years, but specifically this physical loss point of view and operational technology and these sort of issues. And so I'll hand the time over to Faisal for this. Thanks, Faisal.
Thanks, Zane. As Ben had previously pointed, there is a gap between IT and OT, and that includes in the cyberspace. So therefore, the OT environment isn't generally as secured as it should be. Now, the government has implemented and will be implementing a number of additional steps that are coming out of the Home Affairs in order to help organisations better uplift and understand the operational technology environment and help them to better secure it. One of the key things that that organisations need to do is you really have to understand your environment. The operational technology environment isn't an easy environment to understand, and it's not as easy to secure as is the ICT environment. There are a lot of legacy hardware and software that could potentially break if appropriate level security isn't implemented on these devices. So knowing your environment, understanding your environment, and really knowing what can potentially break, what you can secure. There will be items you can't secure, and that's just the way it is in the OT environment at the moment. However, as we move towards more of a digital transformation and you're starting to build out your capability, the foundation that needs to be set are your policies and standards and guidelines. They're going to underpin how you secure your OT environment. They're going to align with industry best practice, and that is what's going to also help you throughout the audit process. Also, a secure by design approach, where as you're implementing new technologies in your environment, everything is architected from the very beginning, along with the cyber architects and your enterprise architects, right? They'll work together to cohesively to make sure that all the new technology coming in is appropriately architected and secured. As Kelly pointed out earlier, people are the weakest link. We are the weakest link. We tend to make more mistakes. So therefore, having appropriate level training and awareness in terms of phishing emails, what to spot in this space, what to click, what not to click, what to do if you're unsure, understanding the impacts to your organization of a cyber breach. So having a digital and physical training and awareness program will go a long way. And also, additionally, we're looking at how do you better monitor what's going into happening in your environment? How do you know there's a threat in there? How do you know that your environment has been breached? You need to be able to know these things in order to be able to react to them and able to be better recover from it. So you should be able to better monitor what's in your environment. And one of the key things that's missing in a majority of the organization is what's called user entity behavioral analytics. This will really allow you to track what is normal and what is abnormal. For an instance, if you have a look at what happened in the US not too long ago, where the water pH levels were altered and they were done remotely, and it was picked up by someone who just happened to notice someone that's in the environment late when they shouldn't have, right? So if that person wasn't quite switched on and it had gone unchecked, then the ramifications that could have been quite catastrophic. However, under what the UBA, so the user entity behavioral analytics, that would have been able to spot any abnormal behavior and provide alerts. So it's an additional layer of security which allows you to better manage human behavior and understand any abnormalities coming out of human behavior as well. And so last, your whole resilience program. Now, as mentioned earlier, vulnerability scanning and penetrations testing, you cannot run these throughout your whole of OT environment with all the legacy hardware that's there, the end of life, end of service tools that are there. There is the potential that something could break and break badly, which will cause significant damage. Therefore, due care and diligence is needed around these tools. You have to be able to understand how to respond to an incident. Right. You could have some of the best tools in the trade, but if you are unable to respond to cyber incidents, then that is a major downfall and a gap. So making sure that you do have some form of understanding of incident response, making sure that you know what type of teams need to be invoked when an incident happens, understanding some of the steps and procedures, making sure the key decision makers are in play. These are all some of the steps in improving your operational technology cyber framework, uplifting your maturity. And you will never be able to stop an attack from happening, but what you'll be able to do is minimize your threat landscape and allow yourself the ability to be able to respond a lot better when an incident does occur.
Okay, thank you, Faisal. Really appreciate that. So how can we help? Really, what we're trying to do for our clients is look at this in a complete sort of framework as opposed to just an insurance solution, so that you can go to your executive teams or your boards and say, this is the issue that we're facing from an insurability point of view. But what we've done is we've identified the risks, we've quantified what the potential losses are, we've found where our gaps are, where we need to improve the risk mitigation so that we can reduce the probability or severity of that, and we have this insurance solution that we can access if we feel there's value in that. And so that's how we're trying to approach the issue. So firstly, looking at where is the bridge between the technology, the operational technology in the IT world, and if that technology was breached, could there be losses occurred, particularly material damage and BI losses? And I think that's really important because there is clients that we have that may not experience these types of losses. So firstly can losses occur, and what are the scenarios that would result in the most damage? That's the first thing that we can help you with. The secondly is, once we've identified those scenarios, is what Ben was talking about before, is helping you quantify what that damage, what the losses might look like. Material damage, BI losses. We're also going to follow up at a later point, talk about liability or financial lines losses. We can help with the quantification on that side as well, so you can understand what's at risk. If it's a loss that's well within your risk appetite and risk tolerance, then you may not need to feel that you need to invest further in mitigation or transfer. But once we've helped quantify that through our analytics team, our forensic accounting team, our cyber team, is working with our cybersecurity team on how can we prevent these scenarios from occurring, and that's from reducing the likelihood of the event, so improving the security so that you're less likely to have a breach or an attack, but also on the severity side. So if you did have operational technology, it's been breached, how can we mitigate that loss on site? And that might be through a combination of offline sensors and triggers that can identify when processes and assets are working outside of their usual sort of operating environment, and so that they can be shut down or alerted quickly. Then finally, once, if you can improve that risk management, but you may still have that underlying risk profile that you want to transfer to the insurance market. And so looking at, well, where's the best investment of money right now? Is it in prevention? Is it in minimizing losses? Is it through that risk transfer? Is it a combination of them? And what's the cost of those alternatives? And Kelly, from an insurance point of view, what's your risk transfer options there? What's your prevention and loss minimization options? How much do they cost? And really working with you to look at what's your best plan of attack to treat that risk from a physical, this is material damage, BI, physical loss point of view. And so yeah, that's really, we've been talking to a lot of clients about this, where we've definitely got capability. If it's something that you feel and in your company you need greater oversight on, then would Kelly and Faisal and myself would be welcome an opportunity to talk about it further. So we're going to move now to our question and answer component to finish up. And so we have had some questions come through. The first one I'll put to you, Kelly, which is, does the definition of cyber risk or cyber event include when a third-party provider is disrupted and a critical service cannot be delivered? For example, payroll, that might be a SaaS service.
Yeah, thanks, and a really good question, and it does come up quite a bit in terms of if the definition extends to that, if the impact is if the impact of this cyber event impacts your operation, then this falls within the definition. Whether that's insurable or not is a different question. In this circumstance, and the circumstance that you've put here, Anna, that would be covered under a standalone cyber policy. So the resultant financial loss or work that you need to do to triage the incident would be covered under a cyber policy. So a really good example of and why insurers are asking a lot of questions for those that are going through a cyber renewal at the moment around, how reliant are you on third parties? Have you had any involvement, or have there been any implications on your business as a result of some of the really high profile third-party breaches that I spoke about before, Microsoft Exchange, SolarWinds, Cillian? Insurers realise that, that everyone is reliant on third parties for their operation. So yes, the short answer is that would fall within the definition of cyber risk.
Okay, great. We've also had another question come through. I think this is best for you, Kelly, is if an organisation does improve their cyber risk management maturity and reduces the attack surface, minimises the probability of the risk, will it be recognised by the insurance market? And do you see that they are rewarding greater cyber security with premium reductions?
So the short answer is, the cyber insurance market is currently doing a bit of soul searching. And I think a few of the clients would have heard me say that there's been a significant increase in claims activity across the board. Ransomware is obviously top of the list and one of the most high profile. So insurers, there are no premium reductions achievable anymore in this class of business. I think that insurers have quickly realised that they probably rated this a little bit too thin, and premium rate corrections are underway. It's a really good question though, and it's one that comes up often. What we found is this is the immaturity of the cyber market, is that there was a big play to build a portfolio quickly. So insurers, there's a lot of competitive tension. There was a lot of insurers really looking to build premium within a premium pool, so that if the losses come in, they would have the money to be able to pay them. So really what's going to go for, and sorry, I should mention that at that time, probably the underwriting discipline wasn't as good. So people that weren't necessarily a great risk could get cyber insurance. What's going to happen going forward is that there will be minimum requirements required to be able to get cyber insurance going forward. Really basic stuff. The Essential 8 is a really good guide in relation to this. MFA, multi-factor authentication. If organisations can prove that they have that across their whole organisation, immediately that improves your risk from an insurer point of view. And there's many other touch points in relation to that. So really, the short answer is there will be minimum requirements going forward to be able to get insurance policy. The greater you can improve your risk in terms of controls and measure, the better you will, the better program we will be able to tailor around you from coverage and a premium perspective.
Another question for you, Kelly, around is there any talk of government reinsurance pool looking at cyber? Because we know that the 300 million capacity, that there's going to be a lot of companies that still have a significant exposure there. So do you know if there has been any discussion or thoughts coming from government around how they might be able to provide some coverage like that reinsurance pool for other risks like terrorism?
Lots of discussions and a lot of lobbying, and we're one of those lobbying in relation to that. As most people on this call will know, even we're a little bit behind even from a terrorism point of view, with that not being in the current pool here in Australia, resulting from a cyber incident. So there is a lot of discussion, but as everyone knows, none of this moves quickly from a governmental point of view, and we don't expect that to happen overnight. So we just cannot rely on that happening. These pools are great. It was fantastic in New Zealand from an earthquake perspective, but they take time. There's a lot of work that needs to go in them and a lot of legislation change. So we're not relying on that, and we're really looking at the market to provide that solution. We will have some more information coming out shortly to clients as what we're doing to push back on property insurers and general liability insurers, and how we're trying to create greater solutions for clients. So really watch this space. It has taken time, but we have seen some significant movement. It's really about getting insurers comfortable around that risk so that they can provide more capacity.
Yeah. No, a good question, Faisal, around if our opinion is, you know, for a framework perspective, should there be should a company look at a process internally or externally to gauge where they are in terms of vulnerability? I would imagine it depends on how well that organization understands their operational technology and the connections and the architecture, because a lot of companies we talk to, there is still not a lot of visibility across the organization on their operational technology risks. But what would you say to that, Faisal? Is it best approached from a self-assessment or an external assessment? And is there a good framework for how they might approach it?
Thanks, Shane. In my opinion, the best approach would be an external assessment, unless you have a really good internal cybersecurity team that is able to run that type of assessment for you. If not, then an external assessment is the best way to go. It'll be aligned to a global operational technology framework, so you'll be pretty much audited against what the industry best practice is in the operational technology and what the bare minimum requirements that you'd be looking at. So I would say external would be the way to go, unless you have quite a strong, robust internal cyber team which can help you in that space.
That's good. Okay, thanks, Faisal. Well, we do have a survey/poll that when you finish, please don't exit straight away when you leave. There will be a poll that will come up, and we invite you to complete that. Help us to get some good feedback, but also to know any follow-up areas that you'd like us to provide any more material for you. We have, please reach out to Kelly. She is the head of cyber practice here. We'd love to talk more. And so if you've got a question around your silent cyber exposures, how we can help you with that, or from an insurance perspective, but also from an identification, quantification and management point of view, then please reach out to Kelly. Really hope you enjoyed our webinar today. We will be sending out the replay and a link to a blog article that you can access so that you can continue to reflect upon this in the presentation. And hope you have a great rest of the week. Thanks, everyone.